Chapter 3, Part 1. When Keith asked for help, he meant it like a placation, maybe? Like, if I let you bandage my knuckles, will you please stop looking like I punched you in the gut? For emotionally repressed idiots. Concession of territory, valid for one night, and one night only. Shiro takes that concession and turns it into a conquering. Twice a day now, Keith is directed to sit at the kitchenette table for Shiro to fuss over. Protesting doesn't get him anything but a stern Keith. That has him biting back a whimper he doesn't understand the source of. Keith sits. Of course he sits. And it's not so bad. The ice packs for his side, the carefully portioned out pain medication, the fresh bandages for his hands. No, that's a lie. Physically, Keith's healing faster and better than he probably would have if he'd been left to his own devices. Emotionally, Keith hasn't known suffering like this since they first started movie nights. Left hand, Shiro prompts. Obediently, Keith offers up his left hand. The right has already been tended to, the bandages perfectly neat and his knuckles pleasantly cool from the gel. After that first morning, Shiro had gone to the CVS off campus to pick up the antibacterial gel with pain relief. The kind of stuff Keith never would buy for himself because why waste the extra $3? Probably it was still a waste of money, but he can admit the way it numbs the pain for a few hours is nice. Coating his fingers in more Neosporin, Shiro gently rubs it across Keith's knuckles. You're healing well, he says. I think by tonight you should be able to sleep without the bandages. The open air will help at this point instead of hurting. All of this is phrased like an observation. Keith knows instinctively that it's not. Tonight he'll get the ice packs and the pain medication and maybe even the gel, but he'll be sent to bed without the bandages. Thumb up, Shiro says, wiping off the excess gel on a paper towel. By now, Keith knows the shorthand. Thumb up, palm flat, fingers relaxed. Keith can hold the position as long as Shiro wants him to, but Shiro never makes him hold it for longer than a minute or so. Gauze is laid over his knuckles, then Shiro pins the start of the bandage to the center of Keith's palm with his thumb before he starts to wrap. Good, he says, as soon as he's gotten the first 2 layers done. This is shorthand too. Keith lets his hand relax into Shiro's grip and be turned this way and that as the wrapping continues. After this point, he just has to stay loose and let Shiro move him. The first couple of times, Keith tried to move for Shiro, to anticipate how he should hold his hand and do it before Shiro had to ask. Each time, Shiro stopped him, gripping his wrist just hard enough to settle him before saying, "Let me," in a way that Keith didn't know how to argue with. Shiro pins the tail end of the bandage in place. All done, he says. Even as he says it, he checks over his work again. Like they don't both know it's perfect. You did well, Keith. Here is another thing Keith's learned in the last few days. The way he sounds when Keith's done exactly as Shiro wanted. It's quietly proud, edges softened by something that resembles contentment, and it makes him want. Sometimes he wants to straighten his spine and preen, because it's golden and bubbly at the base of his spine like that champagne Allura snuck them sophomore year. Those are the easy times. Sometimes, like now, he wants to sink to his knees and rest his head against Shiro's thigh and whine, because it's not enough. Keith's always afraid that his wanting bleeds through into his expression, It must. There's no other reason for the final part of this new ritual. Still holding onto Keith's hand, Shiro leans forward and presses a chaste kiss to his forehead. World Literature 2, better known as Lit for Science Majors, is held in a cramped room in the old Altea Center for the Humanities building. There's only one window, and everyone knows there's asbestos in the ceiling that the university is too cheap to do anything about. Keith always makes sure to arrive a half hour early so he can grab the good table, in the back, by the window, away from the saggiest ceiling tiles, for his group. Today isn't any different, except that he's got a half hour to prod at his bandaged knuckles and think. All of the listicles he read on his research binge said the same vague things. That he just needed to unlock his inner child. That he just had to give in to his natural submissive side. That if he was good enough to justify having a daddy, then all of this would come easy. Keith's not sure, honestly, if he's good enough to justify having a daddy at all, never mind one like Shiro. If he had to rate himself on a 5-star scale of baby boy, he'd be a solid 0. None of this comes easy for him. Except, and maybe it's just that he's desperate, but he can't help thinking about Shiro when Keith tried to anticipate how to move his hand for wrapping. Let me. Nudging his fingers along the seam of his bandages, he figures that maybe being good enough for Shiro wouldn't be so hard if he could just let Shiro decide what good meant. Or not. After all, his knuckles are bandaged because he couldn't control himself. Because he keeps giving in to fantasies that have him biting his pillow to muffle his moans, and giving in to his temper that has him hitting punching bags until his fists ache, and giving in to all the weaknesses that have him wishing he could go back to not feeling anything. If that's all he has to offer up to Shiro. You look like a rain cloud. Keith's full body flinch is miles better than the reaction he would have had a year or two back, but it's still bad enough to make Romelle flush a guilty pink as she inches out of his personal bubble. What's nice about Romelle is that she doesn't apologize. Not because she isn't sorry, but because she understands that apologies come with the burden of going, "It's fine," when it isn't. Instead, she waits until he's relaxed again before she leans into him deliberately. Because it's Romelle, he allows himself to relax even further into a slouch. Her blonde princess hair, longer than even Allura's, smells like bubblegum today. Everywhere their skin touches is warm. Turning big blue eyes on him, she says solemnly, "Remind me to bring you a lavender bath bomb tomorrow." I don't use bath bombs. Or face masks. Or seaweed wraps. If Romelle and Lance were ever able to tolerate one another's presence for longer than 30 consecutive seconds, they'd probably become spa buddies. Rubbing her cheek against his shoulder, Romelle coos, "But lavender is relaxing." Keith glances down at her and weighs his options. Right now, she's smiling. Wide and cheerful and easy. But there's an arch to her brow that suggests challenge. Well then. If I tell you why I look like a rain cloud, will you spare me the bath bombs and the lectures about essential oils? Mm-hmm. Fuck. There's no shame in being outmaneuvered by Romelle, but that doesn't make it any easier to swallow when it happens. Without ceremony, he shows her his bandaged knuckles. Small hands seize his, thumbs pressing into his palm as she twists his hand this way and that to examine it from all angles. He wishes he could smooth away the small furrow between her brows. Upsetting Romelle falls maybe 2 degrees below upsetting Shiro on his personal "I fucked up" scale. After a bit, she lets his hand, still caught between her own, fall to her lap. "You didn't do this," she says, tapping at the bandages. "No." Biting his lip, he looks away from her. While they've been talking, the classroom's started to fill up. No one approaches their table, even though there's an open seat left, and even though it's the best table. The reason for the empty seat comes gliding in then. Really, gliding, with her hair blowing in some unseen and unfelt breeze. Per usual, Allura looks effortlessly flawless. No one could tell, looking at her now, that she complains all the time about how much the back of her neck sweats when she leaves her hair down in this type of weather. Despite the narrow rows between the tables, she weaves back to their table and settles herself delicately in the last chair, like a queen taking her throne. "Good morning," Allura says. Gently, she runs a hand through her hair, causing it to fall back in perfect waves that probably gave half the room a hard-on. Because none of them know about the neck sweat. Idiots. Keith nods at her, which is all he's expected to do this early in the day. "And Romelle?" Romelle lifts his hand from her lap and holds it out in front of Allura for inspection. Like he's a naughty puppy. "Look at this." Or like he's a destroyed chew toy and Allura is the naughty puppy. Neither metaphor is flattering. Lips pressed into a considering line, Allura tilts her head and says, "This is not what I meant when I suggested Bandaids, Keith." For a few blessed seconds, Keith's brain can't connect Bandaids to literally anything. Then it all comes back. In aching detail. Heat floods him, and he knows instinctively that both his cheeks and the tips of his ears have gone red. "It wasn't like that," he says. "I wouldn't..." "Do that? Be that stupid?" "Of course not," Allura says. It doesn't sound like she believes him. Mischief enters her expression as she leans forward. "At the very least, did you ensure that Shiro knows that it was a sandbag and not another person that knocked you about?" Keith stops. Maybe it's just that it's morning, and he's been in his head too much. And Allura is overwhelming at the best of times. Only, he's pretty sure it's weird that she knows about the bag at the gym. Keith planned on taking that information to the grave. Hasn't even told Shiro, which has been a hell of a thing to manage. Settling her chin on his shoulder, Romelle goes, "How did you know where he hurt his knuckles?" Though her tone is entirely pleasant, he can feel the hint of tension in her body as she leans into him more heavily. "And what did you suggest Band-Aids for?" "Ah," Allura says. It's a blatant, obvious placeholder. One that only becomes more obvious the longer she stalls. Finally, she offers up a single name as explanation. "Veronica." Keith allows himself a muted growl. "And the Band-Aids?" Romelle asks. People tend to look at her with a certain set of expectations. Romelle is blonde, and soft, and feminine. Most everything she owns is pink. She's double majoring in international relations and social work. How could she be anything but a kind and cheerful Disney princess of a girl? They focus on the surface, and miss the fact that underneath, she has a crocodile's tendency to sink her teeth in and refuse to let go. Even death will not pry Romelle's jaws open if she's set on something. Today, apparently, is the day that Allura discovers that last bit. Very slowly, she leans back in her chair. Even more slowly, she looks from Romelle to Keith and back again, as though trying to judge which one of the wild animals is more dangerous. It's Romelle. Absolutely. One time, Romelle delivered a call-out post to Lotor in the middle of the quad and made him cry. If he'd been straight, Keith would have proposed on the spot. Whatever conclusion Allura might have drawn about who it was more important to placate is interrupted by the professor walking in. Probably, it's for the best. No one would have won in this scenario. Better that they get distracted by today's PowerPoint. How to Get Away with Murder! The Development of the Russian Novella in the 20th Century. Than deal with Keith's terrible life choices. Somewhere in the blur of the last week, he agreed to study in the library with Pidge, and then promptly forgot it, until his phone pinged with a reminder. Given everything, he figures he owes it to her to show up and let her rant at him for an hour about theoretical physics. This is a lie. Keith gets the reminder at the same time that Romelle tries to corner him about his bandaged knuckles. Retreat is the better part of valor, sometimes. And with midterms coming up, it's actually a semi-valid excuse. There's a chance he'll bomb Dr. Holt's test without the assistance of Dr. Holt's plucky genius daughter. But then, because the universe hates him, Pidge decides to rant at him about the fact that he's given up on his Daddy King plan, and the fact that despite giving up on it, he's still managing to fuck everything up. Wow, you really are a disaster, Pidge says. The most cutting part of this observation is how impressed she sounds. She examines the highlighter in her hand critically before covering an entire paragraph of her textbook in neon yellow. As Keith tries to form a response, any response, she caps the highlighter and tosses it at his face. Reflexively, he dodges, and the yellow highlighter flies past his ear to hit some other poor fucker. The "ow" confirms a direct hit. Neither of them look back to see who exactly got hit. If it was bad enough, the person will come over. If not, they get a free highlighter for their suffering. Shoving his hands through his hair, Keith says, I know. Because he is a disaster. A real live train wreck of a human being. Watch him make the front page of the newspaper. Tightening his grip at the roots, just enough to hurt, he makes himself admit, I just didn't think it would be this hard? Complicated. Pidge, as a general rule, does not do sympathy. So there's no surprise when all this nets him is raised eyebrows. It probably wouldn't have been so complicated if you bothered to research all of this in the first place, she says. You could have gotten some actual advice instead of relying on Lance. And you... This time, he's prepared enough to catch the highlighter she throws at his head. It's the neon blue one. He's pretty sure it's one of her favorites, which makes it all the better he didn't dodge it and let it go flying into the library ether. Pidge would have been ticked, and it wouldn't have mattered that she was the one to throw it in the first place. Letting the highlighter play between his fingers, the same familiar motion he uses with his knife. He waits for her to use her words. What he gets, after several seconds, is, Fine, you have a point. A victory, only in the space it takes for Pidge to push her glasses up the bridge of her nose. I should have asked if you had done the obvious step of research. Honestly, there's nothing he can say in his defense. Lifting his shoulders in a defensive shrug, he says, I got around to it. In a show of magnanimity, she inclines her head and asks, So, what's the next step according to your research? Keith taps the highlighter against his own textbook for a few seconds. debates if he wants to admit the truth or bury it down. Eventually, he settles on nothing. Because it's as close to the truth as he really feels like discussing in the middle of the library at 11 a.m. on a Monday. Are you still pretending like you're giving up on the daddy kink? Desperate, and more than a little panicked, he looks at the nearby tables to check if they overheard that particular announcement. If they did, they don't seem to care, because no one meets his eyes. This close to midterms, everyone is more preoccupied with their own lives than they are with strangers. Even inappropriate strangers. Could you be any louder? He hisses anyway. Pidge props her chin on her hand and rolls her eyes. Yes, she says. I could be. Look, we both know that this has gotten you way closer to climbing on Shiro's dick than anything else in the last 3 years. It's awkward as hell. I'm deeply traumatized. But realistically, we're all grateful that it's put a pause on the pining. You're going to keep doing this. No, he's really not. So what's the next step? Setting his jaw, Keith says, nothing. When she opens her mouth to keep haranguing him, he overrides her with, the research said that it would come naturally. I'm supposed to just let it happen. Wait, really? Pidge freezes, mouth open and fingers going white knuckle around her highlighter. Nothing? Dropping the highlighter, she reaches up to rub at both her temples. All you have to do to get him is nothing. If you had researched this beforehand, you could have spared all of us a lot of trauma. I have to live with the knowledge that Shiro wants you to call him Daddy now, Keith. He doesn't, Keith says. Maybe a little too defensively. Hunching his shoulders up around his ears, he mutters, he doesn't want me to call him Daddy. There's an achingly long pause. Pidge looks like she's caught between the need to keep massaging her temples and the desire to throw every highlighter and pen she owns at him. Which is bullshit. It's not like she's the one who found out that she's not good enough for the love of her life's very specific kinks. Finally, Pidge says, with great feeling, you are a disaster.